So good afternoon. Lieutenant Governor and I are here joined today by Secretary Tom Turco from Public Safety, members of the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus to discuss legislation we're filing today and act to improve police officer standards and accountability and to improve training. But first, I'd like to give a quick update on COVID testing and hospitalization, as we do pretty much every day. As of yesterday, there were another 6,500 additional individual tests and 195 newly reported positive tests. So far, over 700,000 individuals have been tested across the state, and the average positive test rate has dropped to below 3% to 2.6%. Around 1,000 people in the Commonwealth are hospitalized due to COVID. 244 people are currently in the ICU due to COVID, and hospitalizations for COVID are down over 70% since the middle of April. This progress is obviously encouraging and shows that we continue to move in the right direction. It also puts us on a good trajectory with respect to our gradual plans associated with reopening. Decisions to move to the next phase obviously remain rooted in the trends associated with the public health data, and our administration firmly believes that much of our progress has been the result of the behavior and vigilance of the people of Massachusetts. I want to thank you once again for continuing to do your part with respect to washing your hands, socially distancing, and wearing face coverings wherever you can't. These steps matter, and they play a critical role in slowing the spread of COVID. Now, today we're here to announce the filing of a bill to improve public safety and increase transparency and accountability in law enforcement. The legislation is a product of several months' worth of dialogue with members of the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus and with public safety officials across the Commonwealth. This is not the first time our regular meetings with the caucus has produced either a new program or a proposal. We meet with the caucus quarterly and believe this standing meeting has produced many positive results for the Commonwealth. We've worked with the caucus on corrections, criminal justice, addiction, housing, home ownership, state purchasing, construction and economic development, and public safety. And we're very grateful for their insight and their collaboration over the last 5.5 years. The bill we're filing today is the first step in a process that we hope will create a package of reforms that accomplishes the goals that we all share. We began working with the caucus on this effort almost a year ago, largely because Massachusetts is one of only a very few states that does not have a statewide certification program for law enforcement, and we need one. The murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the hands of police officers made clear that now is the time to get this done. Mr. Floyd's death sparked outrage, sadness, and a fortified call for justice and equality from every corner of the United States. People have marched, gathered, and put forward policies and ideas to address the injustices that still clearly exist for communities of color everywhere. There are no easy answers, and improving how law enforcement is only one piece of this process. But I think we've put together a solid set of reforms that everyone, including the law enforcement community and the folks who are here with us today, can work on to advance this bill together. The legislation basically does three things. First, it creates a certification program for law enforcement officers that must be renewed every 3 years. This is consistent with how Massachusetts certifications in other professions like medicine, education, social work, and a host of other highly skilled, critically important positions maintain excellence. It will also create a database of certified officers, ensuring that those officers' training and conduct records are available to their current and future employers. Members of the public will also be able to access certain information about police officers, including their certification status. Second, it creates a process with community involvement for decertifying a police officer, taking that certification away from individuals who do not live up to their training or their oath. Officers who've been found to use a chokehold, for example, or other forms of excessive force, uses of force would be automatically decertified. An officer would also be automatically decertified if they fail to intervene if they witness a fellow officer violating these standards. And third, it creates incentives for advanced law enforcement training and education, focusing on de-escalation, community building, collaboration, human rights, and bias. Here in Massachusetts, we currently have a strong, forward-looking approach to training and education. And thanks in part to leaders like State Police Colonel Chris Mason and countless chiefs across Massachusetts, we in many ways are ahead of other states with respect to training and education. The big gap is we lack a certification program to instill day-to-day accountability and transparency in the system we have. This bill will create a more modern, more transparent, and more accountable system for law enforcement training. It will ensure that men and women who cannot live up to the high standards we expect them to uphold do not stay on the force. And it will give departments the tools that they need to build the community relationships that enable that trust. Now, I've had the pleasure of getting to know countless police officers that put on that uniform for all the right reasons and tragically have seen many lose their lives doing it. It's a hugely important and difficult job. And this bill is not about choosing sides and digging in. This bill is about giving the law enforcement community the training and the resources that they need to serve, which in turn yields high-caliber public servants for our communities. It will also enable us all, law enforcement, public officials, and especially the citizens of Massachusetts, to separate those out who protect and serve from those who don't. The daily injustices that people of color experience are not addressed easily or quickly, and certainly not with a single piece of legislation. We have lots of work left to do. But I want to say thank you again to the caucus for your support and your input on many issues over the course of the last 5.5 years, and especially on this one. And let me close by just saying the session ends on July 31st. It is critically important that by the time that session ends, we have a certification process that can stand up to the integrity, creativity, imagination, and aspirations of the people here in Massachusetts. Thank you. And with that, I want to turn the podium over to Lieutenant Governor.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Governor. As Governor Baker detailed, we are filing legislation to support public safety and create more transparency and accountability for law enforcement. The murder of George Floyd was a tragedy. It was wrong. It was an act of racism. We cannot and will not tolerate these injustices in our Commonwealth. It is evident that here on Beacon Hill and throughout Massachusetts and across our nation, now is the time to listen, to learn, and to make progress. There are many brave men and women in law enforcement that step up every day and answer the call to protect and serve all of us. This legislation will do more to support everyone, residents and law enforcement, as we move forward together. Our bill will ensure officers have access to additional tools, like advanced training for foreign language proficiency, advanced sexual assault and domestic violence response techniques, and de-escalation techniques. It will also help hold accountable and decertify bad actors that tarnish the reputation of our dedicated and honorable police officers. Most importantly, this legislation will do more to address the racial inequities that still exist across our country today. It builds upon our 2018 criminal justice reform law to develop in-service training modules for law enforcement, focusing on bias-free policing and de-escalation techniques. We are also proposing a new committee called the Police Officer Standards and Accreditation Committee to facilitate joint law enforcement and civilian accountability. Together, we are hopeful that these steps will allow us to make progress here in Massachusetts. I want to thank the members of the Black and Latino Caucus and Representative Vieira for their collaboration on this bill and many other initiatives that the Governor highlighted. I also want to thank Secretary Turco and his entire team for their hard work, their sincere efforts and commitment to listening to many stakeholders and for helping to prepare this legislation that we filed today. And we look forward to working with the caucus and our colleagues and partners in the legislature to get this bill through that process and back to the governor's office to sign. It is now my honor to introduce Representative Gonzalez and thank him for his strong leadership on behalf of the caucus and on behalf of our Commonwealth. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, Governor Baker, Secretary Turco, my colleagues in government, my colleagues from the Black and Latino Caucus. Many will say that we are here today because of the cries from Minneapolis. I say that we are here because of the protests and the cries from Minneapolis because of the death of George Floyd, Eric Gardner, Rodney King, and the cries from the slaves and the slave ships, and the cries of our brothers and sisters of the Native American community before this country started. We are here today because the protests have been heard, and now it's time to answer the prayers. We must address the points, the 10-point plan that the Black and Latino Caucus has identified a month ago. We are encouraged by today as a start in that right direction. We are moved by the commitment of the governor, working with the caucus for some time now to address this issue. Today is the beginning of some candid and uncomfortable conversation. As Martin Luther King would say, we have some difficult days ahead. But great leadership is known with 45 days left to the deadline. We want to get this through this session and into the governor's desk and signed. We are confident from the commitment of the Speaker to ban chokeholds and an independent body, and to do the duty to intervene and increase diversity. We are heartened by the Senate President initiating a working group to address the same issues, and for both of them who are committed to moving this expeditiously through the House and the Senate. The Black and Latino Caucus has a firm and strong commitment to addressing our 10-point plan. This is one issue of one of those 10 points. For a long time, we have been addressing race relations. Some colleagues that are not here today, one that is, Representative Russell Holmes. He has led the way on behalf of the caucus on fighting for standards of training, and the standards of training is about police training and support and addressing police misconduct, transparency, and accountability. He has led the way when the road has been bumpy and the visibility has not been clear. He has been the chair of this caucus in the past, and I can say without a doubt, he is a man of principle and committed to the issues that we have addressed here today. I thank him for his leadership in this issue, and to work side by side with him and all my colleagues at the Black and Latino Caucus to make sure that we can work together with all parties involved, including the unions who we have met with individually, to make sure that we get this over the top by the end of this session. It is with great pleasure that I introduce next to the microphone the person that I call steadfast, committed, and dedicated. Tell him like it is, Representative Russell Holmes.
Thank you, Representative Gonzalez. I appreciate him ending with the thing that he's had so much vigor about over the last week, and that is making sure that as we begin this conversation, we make sure we include the police unions who have felt that for so long they have not been included. And it is a unique relationship because, quite frankly, it is one that has been started in earnest under our new chair, on our chair. And he has been steadfast, and I really do appreciate the kind words, but appreciate his energy and his fulfillment of really an idea about what we do when it comes to also the unions and not just what's happening in the building. My comments today are going to begin with actually the end of the State House News article yesterday, and I want to thank Katie for doing it because it begins with the words of an activist, Jamal Crawford, who was on our panel on yesterday. And I'm going to begin with his words because I think they are reflective of so many things that so many of us have been thinking. This is his quote. It reads, "I don't think that there's one silver bullet or pill for police reform as a total. It needs to encompass a bunch of stuff," said Jamal Crawford, who is the founder of the Mass Police Reform. "The climate is now, of course, I guess, that is what people would call, or what we would call the come to Jesus moment. So where many of us have been out shouting in the desert for years and years, and it has fallen on deaf ears, and there's been a reluctance and even a pushback for it. I think now, because of the time, there's a tidal wave that we have to be smart to ride in." Jamal is absolutely correct. We have been shouting, absolutely screaming in the wilderness. And for so long, this bill sat and languished and was forgotten about. And so I call at this moment, I want to just thank many people who won't be on this stage today, but I'm going to call their names because they have been in the fight long before the unfortunate incidents that have begun here recently. Rep. Vieira, of course, I want to thank him. This is a bill that when we began it as a bipartisan bill, one that was not going to be just Democrat or Republican. It was going to be a bill that we are doing because it's right. You saw, for those who participated yesterday, of course, the ACLU and Rasan Hall and his entire team over at the ACLU, Professor Goldman, who of course is thought of as the most knowledgeable person on this topic and has been an incredible advisor to me. The Lawyers Committee, Ivan, Sophia, who was participated yesterday. NAACP, I cannot tell you the amount of conversations I've had with Tanisha and her advocacy around this bill and the importance of this passing for years, shouting in the wilderness. And of course, if I'm talking about the NAACP, I have to talk about my constituent, the governor and I talked about, we are always still reps, Cheryl Crawford at the NAACP. Also, we delayed or asked the governor to delay releasing this because we needed to have a broader conversation with just the community, not just the unions. And so I can tell you the community activists such as Monica Cannon, James Mackey, they had an event on Monday where there really was a thought that we're going to stop the protesting and coming to some common ground around what it is that we're demanding next. And what I was so blessed and thankful to hear is that their conversation was about the 10 points that the elected of color across the Commonwealth had advocated for. They very strong for Representative Miranda's use of force. They were very strong around just making sure the pieces that we have around posts. And of course, the structural racism components are also included. But they've been out, they've been marching, and they've been heard. Also, just want to acknowledge Priscilla Flint, Brother Lowe, that entire group that they sent their demands to us. We hear you. We are responding. We will continue to hear you. And then even last night, I can tell you, I participated in the call around businesses, and black businesses, of course, have not participated wholeheartedly in PPP. So I want to just thank Tito Jackson. I want to thank all the folks at BECMA with Shagan and his crew around what do we do about businesses. And I was very thankful to hear Quincy Miller last night saying that over at Eastern Bank, they're going to make sure that we black people still participate. There are still billions of dollars out there in PPP that we have not gotten, and we need to have the opportunity. So he did it last night, so I figured I would make sure everyone knew. If you're having a problem with PPP, Quincy said, go to easternbank.com, and if you have a bigger problem, email him, qmiller easternbank.com. We need to make sure that we get that part of this conversation started. And then finally, I can't help but to thank for so many. They call the district I represent the Bible Belt of Massachusetts. So of course I have to thank all the clergy, beginning with GBIO, and again a constituent of mine, Beverly Williams, who's a constituent. But at the bottom of my hill where I live, Pastor Borders, of course Pastor Hammond, Pastor Dickerson, Pastor Hughes, and of course my minister, Brother Craigwell, who's my minister and I hear every single day. So my comments are these. We have begun this, and I am thankful for a couple folks who have called, who are former legislators, to the chairman's point. I can recall when Trayvon Martin happened, there was an action that we did as a protest on the House floor where we walked in with hoodies. And we had Rep. Rushing, Rep. Fox, Rep. Swan, Rep. Coakley Rivera, at the time Rep. Enriquez. But I've also received a phone call from Rep. Cavallo saying that this is what we started and we need to get it over the finish line. Just that simple. They may no longer be here, but rest assured they are equally as passionate as all the caucus members that are here today, that they want this solved as well. And we come at a time where, when you think about Black and Latinos, the post-COVID crisis has shown us that essential workers have a different name. They're not just the folks who have all of the titles and the importances. We now have seen that our trash collectors, our nursing home attendants, our MBTA drivers, our grocery store workers. These are the folks that when the governor talks about we are fighting as the Black and Latino caucus, that we're fighting for every day. And then finally, the victims of violence, we hear you. Not just the Trayvon Martins, not just the Rodney Kings, as the chairman said. We have not forgotten DJ Henry and his family, obviously from here in Massachusetts. And of course, we have not forgotten the Floyd family or the Brooks family. Continue to email us, continue to call us, tweet us, Facebook, all of the things that you're doing, because there's no member of this caucus who does not hear you. None of us. And we are going to amplify your voices every single day. That is what we do. Do not think that you're not being heard. Do not think that as you protest, we are not there with you. Things that get measured get done. Just that simple. Just that simple. It is now time for us to measure our police officers. It is now time for us to do and hold them to the same account that we hold every other profession in the Commonwealth. Every other one. So as the chairman said, we've been in many conversations with the police, and in those conversations, they've said, wait, in some ways we're different than barbers and electricians and other folks. But in every way they're named that they were different, it was clear to us that that's why they need to be held at a higher standard. How can we hold folks who are doing our nails and our hair at a lower standard than someone who can take my life? How can we hold someone who is a financial planner at a higher standard than someone who can take my civil liberties? This post-legislation begins that process and that conversation. I am sick and tired of hearing constituents say, we asked for a badge number, and I didn't get it. Those days are over. They are coming, where I will look at your name, I will see your badge number, I will then, on my phone, be able to look you up, understand your certifications, understand your training, and understand if you have done things that meet a requirement that I can see and understand your history. I envision a day where I get pulled over, because that will happen, and I will sit in that car like so many folks do, and we wait around for 15 minutes for them to come give us our ticket. They're reviewing our background, our driving records, but I will view theirs too. So while they're back there in that car sitting there chilling, making me wait because they want me to be penalized for whatever speeding or whatever it may be, I will make sure I understand that person as well. That is the standard that we're looking for. All of us go shopping. We go to Walmart. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say a name. We go to stores. And while we're at the stores, we look at some product and we say, hey, what's the most important thing and what should I pay because there's competition. I look forward to the day where the constituents I represent will be able to stand on the street and not feel as though they can be intimidated, not report on someone, and know that they know who you are. You are no longer hidden from us. You are not a person who I cannot investigate on my own. I don't need to come beg you through a FOIA report to figure out who you are. That is the bill that we are proposing. That is the bill that I know we can pass. So I'm sure my statements were a little longer than what we expected, but let me just say, this caucus isn't just on this bill. This caucus is not just on this bill. This is one of 10 things that we demand get passed. But beyond those 10, there are many other things that we are working on. We are just asking and demanding, quite frankly, moving forward on all pieces of legislation. We are at the front of a conversation. We are in every room. Sometimes people say, well, there are only 13 or 14 members of the caucus. We punch above our weight just like Massachusetts punches above its weight every single day. There's only one member of this caucus in the Senate. Give her all the direction, all the attention she needs to make sure she is able to drive not only this legislation, but all legislation that the caucus is pushing. She can punch above her weight as well, and we're demanding that you listen to her on the Senate side as well. Those are my comments, and just know I appreciate the governor and the lieutenant governor very much. He did say we've been working on this for months. Why are we releasing this, and why is this the first thing out? It is the first thing out because I admire the fact that he was willing to do this when nobody else was. Just that simple. Just that simple. This is not an action that happened because this bill is not an action that happened because of the recent unfortunate incidents. This is a commitment he made to us as a caucus a year ago. He made it because it was right and not because of an emotional decision of an emotional moment. That's how I want leadership to look. Do what's right, even when other folks are not willing to do it. And thank you, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, for doing that. Thank you.
Let's start on topic. Questions for either of us or for the other folks who are here?
Governor, there seems to be more groups in this building now that are crafting and filing police reform legislation in the House leadership, the Senate leadership, Representative Brandon, Senator Green, and of course yourself. Where does your bill fit into these groups, and how does it differ, if at all?
Well, I guess what I would say is that there are a whole bunch of bills that deal with this whole question around accountability, transparency, brutality. And I would argue that ours is one of several. The one thing I would say about our bill is it's based on a series of conversations that we've been having for a while with the caucus and with others. And it's a pretty comprehensive approach to establish a program. I mean, I admire the heck out of Rep. Vieira and Rep. Holmes for hanging in there on this issue around trying to create a commission, a process to get somewhere on putting a program in place when it comes to accreditation, certification, and decertification. What my hope is that our bill at least can be used as a jumping off point, a communication or a conversation starter to make sure, because remember, we only have 45 days here until the end of the session, and a lot's got to happen between now and the 31st of July. That's why I ended my remarks by saying this really needs to get done in what is basically 6 weeks. And whether it's our bill or our bill modified or Rep. Miranda's bill or some of the other pieces of legislation, or the negotiation that the caucus is currently having with other folks in law enforcement, or some of the work that's being pursued by the task force in the Senate. Honestly, my goal here, my hope here, is that between now and the end of this session, a piece of legislation that creates a certification and decertification program here in Massachusetts, along with some enhanced training modules that has civilian and law enforcement representation, will find its way to our desk, and we'll be able to sign it and stand it up. I mean, the other thing about this is I really want to be able to stand this up in a relatively short period of time. I don't want to get, you know, what would really disappoint us, I think, is if we got something that created a process to get to the point where we create a program. I mean, I want a program. I want the legislature to take either what we filed or something else and give us, in the next 6 weeks, a program that we can stand up so that we can, in fact, be aspirational about the way we think about training and the way we think about certification and the way we think about decertification, and that we put in place a model that gives citizens a voice, gives law enforcement a voice, but gets us to the point where people really believe that there's transparency and accountability in policing. And I get the fact that it's 6 weeks from now. We were originally talking about trying to do this administratively and sort of urging people to participate and to make this happen. I really think this is a moment, and it's a moment where this kind of legislation should get enacted.
Governor, in addition, 5 days, 6 weeks in the session, you know, that's not a ton of time.
I know.
Would you be pro extending sessions? Would you urge your legislative colleagues to extend sessions if one of these pieces of legislation couldn't get done in that time?
You know, the legislature's been pretty adamant about not letting its session run into the election season, and I understand why. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, I look around this room, there are a few other people who are probably old enough to remember what this process was like when you got into lame duck sessions. It wasn't pretty. But honestly, you know, to get back to your point, there's been a lot of talk about this for a long time. There's been a lot of dialogue about this for a long time. There are models that can be borrowed, or people can work off the draft of the legislation that we're submitting. We get the fact this is step one. But I really think this is something that ought to happen by the end of the session. The other thing I'll say is we were on a call, Zoom, what do you call those things, WebEx, whatever, with the caucus the other day, and one of the members, I can't remember which one, said, you know, today we're talking about transparency and accountability in law enforcement, but that is the beginning of a discussion about a bunch of other things, and I agree with that. I mean, this is not the sort of thing that between now and the end of this session and the start of the next session, I want to start working on some other stuff so that when the legislature comes back in January, we have other stuff we can file to chase some of the other initiatives that are important here. I mean, as I said in my remarks, you know, we have an $80 million home ownership program that came about as a result of work that was done with the caucus. Pure and simple. And there are a bunch of different initiatives that are either works in progress, or we're going to make an announcement soon on Boston State Hospital, which is going to come straight out of the dialogue that we had with the caucus about contracting and purchasing and procurement. I mean, there are a lot of other things we can and should be doing here. And but this one really needs to get done by the end of the session.
Governor, in addition to chokeholds, are there any other police tactics specifically in your bill? For instance, no-knock, search warrants on drug cases, that kind of thing, which is in Nancy Pelosi's bill?
So there's a list of about 8 or 9, depending upon the account, what we would call mandatory decertifications. Chokehold is one of them. Duty to intervene is another. Not intervening in a particular incident. So I said in my remarks, when somebody violates what we consider to be standard practices, conviction of a felony, conviction of certain misdemeanors, violation of human rights, excessive force under a variety of scenarios. There's a bunch of them. And then there's a process for what we would call discretionary decertification, where, you know, a body of work or a series of incidents could lead to the commission making a decision to pursue a decertification hearing with respect to somebody. But that's exactly the sort of thing that I would fully expect the caucus and the legislature to engage on, to figure out what they think the right list of discretionary and mandatory decerts should be.
Have you talked to the unions about all this, and how do they feel, and your state police, for instance?
Well, the state police are actually in this. I mean, if you're a community law enforcement officer, if you're a college law enforcement officer, if you're a deputized officer working in the community on behalf of the sheriff's department, if you're a state police officer, if you're a municipal police officer, all those folks are basically part of this training and certification regimen.
But have they had input into the bill, or do you expect pushback from the unions?
I can't ever remember filing a bill on anything where there wasn't agreement and disagreement, and I fully expect there will be on this one too. But again, that's why it's so important that we not let the noise get in the way of the objective, which is to get this done by the end of the session.
Governor, you said you're looking into a number of other things related to this conversation. The ACLU of Massachusetts is already responding to your bill saying it's a great first step, but we want an end to qualified immunity for officers. Is that something that Massachusetts would consider?
I would love to see that dealt with at the federal level, and I do know that there's a federal discussion going on right now with regard to that issue. It's a harder issue to do on a state-by-state basis. It's based on federal law and federal constitutional policy. I would love to see it get dealt with there.
Do you have any thoughts on the president's executive order relating to police?
Unfortunately, I haven't read it yet, so not at this time.
Governor, could you elaborate on what aspect?
Go ahead.
Question for Representative Holmes. It was mentioned earlier that Massachusetts is one of the few states that doesn't have a STEP certification program, but obviously in other states it hasn't deterred bad behavior from some of those bad apples. So if you could just speak to what this could actually bring to folks here that's as significant as you feel it is.
I guess the easiest way I like to say, we can yank your license. I think that a person who is misbehaving, we should have the right to no longer allow you to come into our communities. Just that simple. One of the questions that came up yesterday in the town hall was, do we have the number? They asked Professor Goldman, do we have the numbers for what happens in other states that do decertify? Have there been some proof that this is a positive thing? And his answer was, no, we haven't done the numbers and the data. But think about every profession, whether it be doctor, lawyer, whomever. Removing as many people who are inappropriate in that profession is a positive thing. And so some of the challenges, quite frankly, that we were discussing right before we came out was, what do we do about the folks who are now already a part of police? And this bill, the way it's proposed today, would grandfather everyone in, and then we would look to have them go through the decertification process. But getting the folks who may have incidents on their background now, my advocacy to the governor, lieutenant governor, and Secretary Turco was that if someone has an incident already that's in their background that would have precluded them from continuing to be a police officer, and we've already grandfathered them in, let's try our best to make sure they are in that first round of certifications and recertifications to let them know that will never happen again, ever.
You've been talking with the State Police Chiefs Association and Boston.
I'm going to actually defer this one to the chairman. He's the one who's been having those conversations. Chair?
Sure. Your caucus has been
Can I
speaking.
say one other thing about almost every one of these accreditation programs does not have a big civilian presence, all right? The proposal we're making, again, which came out of our conversations with the caucus, has 7 folks from law enforcement and 7 folks from the community. That's a really different governing model than you're going to see in any of these other states that have an existing post program in place. The second thing I would point out is in most of those certification programs, and they vary a bit from state to state, you don't have the sort of comprehensive list of automatic decerts that we're proposing in our bill. That is, in fact, different than the way most of these others work. I do think what we tried to do was model it on the stuff we thought worked well in other states, but also made some pretty significant changes in terms of representation and rulemaking to deal with what we thought were some of the limitations of the way these programs have been set up in other places.
Chairman Gonzalez, I know
been honest, candid discussion, and right now there's not pushback. There's opportunity for us to both listen to each other and learn from the experiences from the boots on the ground to better understand how we, if passed legislation, impacts them. So I think it's been a great opportunity for both sides to address the concerns that obviously we have with police misconduct, and I've never heard pushback from any officer or union saying that they're against addressing some of the bad and misconduct that officers have been known to do.
What are their concerns about the idea of decertifying officers?
Well, obviously, if you saw our joint statement, I think they will have some concerns, but some of them have addressed that they don't like the word licensing and they prefer the word certification. And apparently, to some degree, in some arenas of law enforcement, it's happening already in Massachusetts.
Chair Wallace, or Dr. Baker, another one. Does this bill outline the process for recertification? Is that in legislation at all?
Yeah, it's basically, it's like the equivalent of a 3-year certification, and you have requirements you have to meet every year to get in-service updates in your training and continuing education. The same way it would work, as both Chair Gonzalez and Representative Holmes said, as it would work for other certified or licensed professionals.
So I guess, how if you get decertified, is there a path back to getting your certification again?
If you get decertified, you're done.
Governor, about the information that would be publicly available, can you elaborate on what information a member of the public could get? And then secondly, you've all mentioned commitment to not just this bill, but other steps. What would be the next part of the 10-point plan you would be committed to working on with the caucus, assuming everything goes right and this bill is passed and ratified?
Let's get this bill passed. I mean, 45 days. Several of the folks here mentioned the fact that that's a short period of time. It is. I would really like to make sure that by the 31st of July, we have in place a credible, aspirational program with respect to how we handle certification and transparency and decertification here in Massachusetts.
And
You can go right ahead.
I know you still have the open question about what's public. We hear you. But the timeline is this. We're anticipating the bill being released today. Literally at 2 o'clock today, the chair and the caucus will meet with Claire Cronin, who's the chair of the judiciary, who the speaker has asked to, as I mentioned yesterday, craft a bold piece of legislation. And we're, just like today, demanding that we are the lead on that conversation. And so Claire and the speaker, we're saying to them, do not put a pen to a paper until you've heard from us. And so we expect them to hear from us today. And then we're thankful that the Senate President appointed as co-chair on the Senate side, Senator Jane Diaz, on the working group on that side as well. We had a meeting with a Zoom, as the governor said, with the Senate President on Monday. The chairman orchestrated that, and we were clear to her as well. We expect that to go through the Senate and to go through our Senate member advocating for this caucus. Obviously, we will still do Zoom meetings for all of us to have our voice, but our Senate member will represent us on that side as strongly as she can, working with our chairman. And so both Speaker and the Senate President have a more what we would call an omnibus bill. They believe we're going to get in Rep. Miranda's piece. They believe they can get this done. They believe we can get this done. I would like them to prove it. And so I'm hoping that they're having rigorous conversations. I asked the Senate President, please make sure every step along the way you're talking to the governor. We do not want a pocket veto. We do not want a pocket amendment. We do not want a change at the end. We want the bill that we're asking for to be passed in the House and the Senate and with the governor's legislation. So we are working, as I said yesterday, trying to get to a timeline that is more July 20th. It gives us our 10 days to be able to have the governor review his bill, send back in the amendments. We know that's tight, but the Senate President said she understands the timeline and will try her best to adhere to it as well.
You mentioned that you envision a time when someone who has an encounter with a police officer, right then and there, look them up on their phone.
So I've been asking Secretary Turco that question for a little while. He thinks he can get it all done within the next 6 months. There will be an enormous amount of negotiations, obviously, with the unions and what can be online immediately and all of those things. But I gave the example recently, my wife's a teacher. She can't show up in a room teaching English because you can go look up her name and say, wait a minute, you're a phys ed teacher. You're in the wrong room. That's the level of transparency we're asking for every profession. It's really not that hard. It really isn't. And so we're at least, and what I think is important for people to understand is not all police officers are the same today. What do I mean by that? Boston in particular does somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 or so hours of training. There are other police forces that unfortunately are doing 300, maybe 400 hours of training. And you can just understand that me, as a black man, when I get pulled over in Boston, I want a well-trained officer. Please, let me also say that because the chairman likes to reinforce, we want the best officers we can possibly have. My neighborhood is not asking for less police. We want the best, most trained officers we can possibly have, period. Pulled over in Boston, or when I get pulled up in Lee, or when other place in this Commonwealth, that part-time officer looks exactly the same to me who has only 300 hours of training as a person who has 800. That needs to change. Everybody with a badge and a gun needs to have the same level of training, and everybody needs to understand that there are implicit bias lessons they need to have that may not have been, that surely would not have been part of a reduced program of 400 hours. There is a lesson around de-escalation that surely would not have been part of a program that you have reduced training. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. And so now we're going to, I've heard also yesterday on the question of this training, hey, at a time when so many folks are asking defund the police, we're looking to give the police more money. Well, my answer to them is the same I'll give to you today, which is simply anyone who pulls me over, anyone with a badge and a gun, and typically almost, unfortunately in this state, that's a white guy, any one of them who pulls me over needs to make sure that they have the appropriate training to understand my culture, who I am, and never again should I be sitting on the sidewalk with my arms behind my back and handcuffed while you search my car and I can't see who you are. I want to know who you are. That is
Would you like to see the percentage of police officers?
Oh, come on, that's the next conversation. That is the easy.
Reflective of the population within the
So,
community.
thank you for asking the question. Let me just simply let you know that is part of the 4 demands that we have at the state level. Civil service. We just felt like as a caucus, we probably are not ready to take that fight on at the exact same time we're trying to take on the fight with trying to figure out the reforms in patrol. But the primary challenge we have around that, of course, is veterans. And we plan on probably being in another press conference of this nature at some point very soon. The speaker has committed to some review of civil service that is absolutely one of our 10. And we absolutely, and one of the things that the chairman and I talked for quite some time with the police and the unions about was, do you believe? And what I loved about the chairman asking them was he said to them, we've been asking or demanding more diversity in the police departments for years, years. We come with our own ideas of civil service and the like, and what can we do about language preference and all of those things. He asked them, he said, do you have an answer to diversity? I asked him, do you believe a more diverse police staff is a good police staff? Is that a better police staff? Someone who understands culture, language, and all of the other things. They said yes. And so now the caucus is asking them to come with your ideas. You come tell us how you think you can diversify. Because Governor and I, he and I have had this conversation. A state police that is 95% male and 90% white is unacceptable. Unacceptable. So we're coming that way, John. We just haven't gotten there on this bill.
I'll give you one follow-up to Representative Holmes' comments. We have a bill that's currently pending before the legislature. Not to muddy the waters a little here, but it's a state police reform bill. And one of the things it has in it, in addition to a number of other administrative reforms, is the opportunity for the state police to create a cadet program that cadet program would be a terrific tool in helping to diversify the state police. It's actually worked pretty well in the city of Boston. And the last class of cadets, because of some work that was done by the colonel and his team based on some guidance and advice we got from the caucus, was the most diverse class. It was a big one. It was also 240 trainees who came out of that academy. That's almost twice the size of a typical class. Was the most diverse class, I think, ever. And we completely agree that, and so does the colonel, that the state police needs to be more diverse, and not just around race and ethnicity, but also around gender. And I'd love to see that legislation we've got pending pass, because it would, in fact, make it easier and more possible for us to continue to diversify the state police.
Yeah. So one of the other projects that the caucus has been leading when you talk about diversity has been a dashboard. Boston has a dashboard today where you can go and look to see at every department, every school, wherever you go, you can see the diversity, what people earn, things of that nature. Sandra Borders has been Pastor Borders' wife, again, my constituency, so got to be special. They has been leading the program, and literally we had the colonel in with one of the presentations. That's going to be stood up, I'm hoping, very soon. It's something we've been working on for months and months and months. Where literally, again, something that gets measured, gets done. We want to measure every single department in this state, not just state police. But it is clear with diversity, the higher you go in the state, whatever it is, whatever job you have, you are getting whiter and whiter and whiter, and that is unacceptable by the caucus, and we want that to be measured as well, and that should be released soon as well.
Last question. Question for Miranda on the use of chokehold. Can you discuss how your plan and your legislation fits into all of this? I know some police unions that have said that they're in Massachusetts, they believe the level of training is ahead of the curve compared to Minnesota, Kentucky, other states. So, what would be the biggest impact or change really here with your legislation?
I think it's clear with the Black Latino Caucus and the electeds of color who joined us about a month ago that we don't see one intervention as the only intervention or the one pill, the silver bullet, to create change in Massachusetts. Our policing history is 160 years old. The founding of this country is 400 plus years. And we know we have to do multiple things to make public safety more just and transform it. I believe strongly that use of force should also be standardized, and we should be talking about what is excessive and deadly force and removing some elements that we have not standardized in the Commonwealth. Massachusetts often leads the way. It's the first. I know I'm from Boston, we're the city of champions, and we want to make sure that regardless of what is happening in other states in the country, that we go further, we do better, and we do right by the residents of this state.
Yeah. No, we're going to deal with correctional officers through a different process because they don't actually, they really don't operate in the community. This was really about creating a program model for all of the officers, either as part of their standing work or deputized, actually work in the community. And we think the correctional piece needs to be dealt with through a separate mechanism. Thanks, everybody.
Governor, can you take it off topic?
Pardon me?
Can you take it off topic?
Sure.
What's the status of the work going on with the women compression station? Federal court vacated the air rights situation based on what they said was incomplete work by the DEP?
We are currently discussing that with the Attorney General. We haven't made a decision about how to pursue it because we've been talking to the AG's office about it.
You got a lot of worried people down on the South Shore concerned about the situation. They say that the DEP isn't really paying a lot of attention to the project.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that the judge's decision basically said on almost every single one of those issues that people worry about, that was not really where he felt there were issues or concerns. His big issue was around whether or not there needed to be a substation along with the compressor station, which DEP, as a fundamental rule, felt the community wouldn't want and would be really expensive. But that's the issue that we currently need to talk to the AG's office about and figure out how to pursue.
Governor, amusement parks, any chance based on the data you have?
Say again?
Amusement parks, based on the data you have, any chance those could be moved up in the phase
So with respect to moving more quickly on some of these initiatives as our data has improved, I mean, I understand both the impatience and the anxiety that's associated with that. The Lieutenant Governor and I hear it pretty much every day. But I would just say to people that the folks who went fast on reopening in many parts of the country are now dealing with a second set of significant issues with respect to growth rates in their positive tests. Some of them are now testing at a positive level that's above anything that they were dealing with previously. And while I get how impatient people can be about all this stuff, and I completely understand it, a big part of our success here in the Commonwealth has been people's willingness to change the way they live their lives and to respect the virus and to do the things that they have been doing around their own individual decision-making around wearing a mask, socially distancing, hand washing and hygiene and all the rest, and being patient about the reopening process. And I guess what I would say is we are going to continue to chase the data, but as the Lieutenant Governor and I have said on many occasions, our goal here is to create a sustained reopening. We know that it's likely that we're going to be dealing with this thing again in the fall, which is why we've been so aggressive about building additional testing capacity and creating a pretty robust tracing program, which seems to be working. But we're going to continue to be careful and vigilant about the reopening process, just because we think, based on all the evidence, not just here in Massachusetts, but elsewhere, it's important that we respect the virus and not get too far ahead of ourselves. Say again?
Last week at the food bank, you sort of urged the legislature to move quickly on that sub-budget. But it's odd, the sub-budget has no itemized spending at all. It's sort of like, give me $1 billion and I'll get reimbursement. Why every sub-budget you normally do has, we're spending this on this, this on this, this on that. How come not for that?
Because it's a budget that's designed to dedicate state resources to what in fact are federally reimbursable expenses incurred under COVID-19 that we know are federally reimbursable at the state and municipal level, but cannot be federally reimbursed until we actually have an appropriation on the state side. You could call it almost a technical issue in some respects. The legislature knows, they know what's on that list. They know what's on that list. They do. But remember, this is about getting federal reimbursement for COVID-eligible expenses as a result of the order that we issued and the President signed. And until we get authorization from the legislature to actually create the state spend on that, we can't chase reimbursement on this. And the reason it's a big deal is the federal government appropriated $45 billion to FEMA. FEMA doesn't get money all the time. They get money when there's a disaster. And they will then spend that money based on what states submit for reimbursement until they run out. Now, that doesn't mean they won't have an obligation to Massachusetts or to our cities and towns. It just means if they don't have the money, they won't actually send it to us until such time as they get another appropriation. So there is a little bit of a this is a little bit of a race between states and cities and towns to actually access federal reimbursement. The other thing the Fed said, which is critically important to this, is that states could use CARES Act money to represent state and local shares on federal reimbursement. So that means the cost to the Commonwealth, the taxpayers of the Commonwealth, or the taxpayers of cities and towns that are chasing this reimbursement is dramatically reduced, practically to zero, by virtue of having CARES Act money that people can use to pay for the state and municipal share and a federal reimbursement that's committed under the existing declaration we've got in place. But until there's an authorization to create a so-called state spend to be reimbursed, the clock's ticking and other states are chasing this, and I worry a lot about how long the federal resources are going to be there to actually get reimbursed in a reasonable period of time. Every once in a while, when we have smaller disasters that are federally reimbursable, it'll be 2 or 3 years after that disaster before that receivable that we've got to the federal government actually gets paid. In this case, you're talking about a receivable that would be hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, which is why we would like to see it booked and submitted and reimbursed before that FEMA appropriation runs out. Thanks, everybody.